Hello everyone, and welcome to NeoSystems webinar, the CFO's Guide for Upgrading to Costpoint 7. A couple of weeks ago, we did the CIO's Guide for Upgrading to Costpoint 7, and that recording is available on our website. And today, we're going to take a look at the CFO's perspective. Our agenda: first, we're going to do a brief introduction, and then we're going to get into the highlights, implications, of all the changes that occurred in Costpoint 7 coming from Costpoint 6. And then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the functional upgrade and what you need to consider in your scheduling, as well as take a look at some other considerations. Then we're going to share with you some resources that are available to you, and then we'll open it up to questions. As always, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, please feel free to type your question in the question box. At NeoSystems, we're proud to say, grow ahead, we've got your back office. At NeoSystems, we provide strategic back office services. These include accounting, HR, and IT. Accounting, we do accounting in Costpoint. IT, we host Costpoint, including Costpoint 7 here. IT team has also helped many companies with their technical upgrade on-premise. And for HR, we have an HRIS system that fully integrates with Costpoint. Currently, we have 500 companies, which represents over 30,000 employees in our secure private cloud. We also have consulting services that form an umbrella over our accounting, IT, and HR services. Consulting services including implementations. Our NeoSystem employees have completed hundreds of successful implementations of Costpoint. We also do Costpoint upgrades. We are currently or have completed over 50 upgrades from Costpoint 6 to Costpoint 7. With me today, I have Randy Cole. Prior to joining NeoSystems, Randy was with Deltek for 15 years. With Deltek, he led the Costpoint 7 User Interaction Design team. So if you have any questions about the changes in the user interface, Randy is the guy to ask. In addition, he also led many Costpoint implementations, and he led the implementation teams, as well as running quality control for Deltek. With NeoSystems, Randy and his team manages the Costpoint accounting for several Costpoint companies, making him an ideal person to provide the CFO's perspective on Costpoint 7. I'm Brian Giblin. I'm a product manager here at NeoSystems. I get out and talk to clients, non-clients, to understand some of the business challenges they're having today and to identify software solutions that can bring them a great deal of benefit and mitigate those challenges. Talking about the upgrade to Costpoint 7, one always has to keep in the back of their mind the customer care support lifecycle. And it's worth noting that the Deltek Costpoint 6.1 Service Pack 2 goes into sustaining support on April 30th. We'll talk a little bit more about the implications of that in just a bit. But first, I want to get to know a little bit more about you. So we're going to open up our first poll and ask, when do you plan to start your upgrade to Costpoint 7? Some of you may already be on Costpoint 7. Many of you, I suspect, are in the process of upgrading to Costpoint 7 already. Some of you might be starting it in 1 to 3 months, within 3 to 6 months, or more than 6 months. And we did a poll like this for the CIO's webinar that we did 2 weeks ago. So I'm going to see if we get similar or different results. Close the poll. Let's share the results. Very interesting indeed. Looks like the largest answer is those who are 38% for those within the next 1 to 3 months. And followed that by some of you are in process of upgrading now, and more than 6 months for 21%. Similar results. We did get a stronger results for more than 6 months last time, but very similar also, though, on the 1 to 3 months. Many of you are in the getting ready to get started, so this will be an excellent webinar for you to join in on. And but for those of you who are in the process of upgrading, hopefully we'll have a few tips for you that can save you a lot of time as well. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Randy Cole.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate everybody joining us today and giving up their lunch hour to talk to us, or at least to listen to us. Brian mentioned I worked for Deltek for several years, and during that time, at least the last few years I was with Deltek, we spent a great deal of time moving Costpoint from version 6 to version 7. So I want to talk to you about some of the benefits of Costpoint 7 before I actually get into the implementation and what it's like to upgrade it. So when you think about Costpoint 7, from a functionality standpoint, it's very much like Costpoint 6. They've added a few new features, but not a tremendous amount. Most of the effort going from Costpoint 6 to Costpoint 7 is really focused around the user interaction and the usability of it. One of the things we looked at in Costpoint 6 is, people have been using it, and when I say we, this is back when I was at Deltek. People have been using for Costpoint for well over 10 years at the time, and there were things they liked about it, things they didn't like about it. And at the time, Deltek realized that it may not necessarily be the easiest system to use. So we're looking to move to Costpoint 7 and re-architect the entire system. We said, now is the time to really go through, figure out what needs to be fixed, and attack those particular issues. So what Deltek did is went out, picked up, partnered with some interaction usability experts, had them come in, but they weren't really looking to talk to Deltek because we obviously knew how Costpoint is supposed to work. What they did instead is went out and talked to Deltek customers. Because they were located in the DC area, they primarily talked to various customers in the DC area, both large and small customers. But they didn't ask them how did they use Costpoint. They said, how do you do your job? How do you think about doing your job? They wanted to be able to get away from, well, I do the way Costpoint tells me to what do I really need to do my job so that we can redesign Costpoint in order to support that. So as you start looking at Costpoint 7 as opposed to Costpoint 6, the functionality is all there, but the way the user interacts with the system is going to be very different. There's a lot of new features. We'll go over a sampling of those shortly. So on top of the usability, the improved user interface, just a lot of the changes they made were also increased the ability to use and work efficiently. An example, when I was with Neo and we were setting up our training database, we were going through, we started from scratch, so we had to set up an entire new system, load employees and things like that. We had roughly 80 employees in there. So as I was going through continuing to set those up so that we could start putting transactions in, we obviously had to have leave for those employees. So with 80 employees, and to set up the leave, you first have to set up the leave record for each employee and then set up the leave types for each employee. So we had 2 leave types, a holiday and a PTO. So for each of those 80 employees, basically there were 3 records to be set up, the leave type and then 2 different leaves. In a Costpoint 6 environment where you have to go through, you set up each one of the employees, save after each one, then you go through and you set up the leave, then you set up the leave types. That could probably take a good bit of time. That would probably take me with 3 records per 80 employees, easily 240 minutes, so about 2 hours to get that accomplished. Because of the improvements in the way that you interact with Costpoint 7 and using the web, I was able to do that in right about 40 minutes, between 30 and 40 minutes. So the functionality provides a great deal of efficiency as you're doing your day-to-day jobs. Similarly, I've been working recently with a client who's still on Costpoint 6, and while we're looking to get them Costpoint 7 as quickly as possible, just the inefficiency of working with 6 after having worked with Costpoint 7 for so long really has driven in the frustration at the loss of efficiency having to work in Costpoint 6 in the client server environment. Some additional functionality improvements are the ability, improved functionality around printing and report distributions. In Costpoint 6, you're really limited to whatever your output your printer will give you. If you have an Adobe drivers, you can put it in PDF or you can put it out to paper, but that kind of really limits to what your capabilities are. In Costpoint 7, they really expanded that. They give you the ability to still print out to a piece of paper if you want, but you can also download those files. As you're downloading, you have the choice of printing it to a PDF natively. You don't have to go out separately and acquire an Adobe or a PDF or something like that. It automatically gives you the ability to download it in PDF. It also gives you the ability to download into a doc format. So if you want to pull it into a word processor and do some special formatting or something, you can also pull it into an Excel format. Before you get too excited, The Excel format is a formatted report. It's not an Excel data dump. We'll talk about that a little bit later, however. But on top of being able to download those files and those formats, you can also email directly out of Costpoint. So if I'm running our project status reports and I want to send them out to a particular project manager, I can go through, set up more report parameters, and in those report parameters, save it as an email output. Put in that project manager's name, tell it any additional files I want to include, and then when I go to print the report, it'll automatically email it out to that person. So it really creates an ease of distribution for you. A couple other functionality there. You can also archive reports. What that does is actually takes and creates and saves a copy of the report output itself in the database. What that means is it's now captured in the database. It's saved there. When you back up the database on a nightly basis, your reports are backed up there. Obviously, you're not going to want to do that for all of your reports, but there are reports, for instance, maybe you want to take a snapshot in time of your employees and their salary information. Or one that I personally have found very useful is invoices. If you think back to Costpoint 6, when you're producing an invoice, once you've printed that invoice and posted it, that invoice disappears. You can't go back and reprint that report or that invoice out of the system. What you're able to do in Costpoint 7 is, as you're printing it, print it to an archive copy. Now that invoice image is now saved in the database itself. That means at any point in time I can go back and pull that image back up and reprint it if I needed to. So it can save you a lot of time and a lot of frustration having to keep track of where did I store that copy, things along those lines. The other really nice thing is I don't have to do these one at a time. It's not like I have to print it out, then I have to save a copy, then I have to archive a copy, then I have to email. I can do all of these things at once. So I go through and I set up my multiple capabilities. I hit print one time, and it does all of those in one fell swoop. Another really nice thing is the ability to access Costpoint through a browser. Think back to Costpoint 6. Costpoint 6 was a client-server architecture. What that meant is part of the system was running on your local workstation as well as part of it was running back on the server itself. What that means from an IT perspective, without getting too detailed, is the IT needs to come and touch every machine that you're going to run Costpoint on. They actually had to do an install. With Costpoint 7, all you need is a browser. And when I say all you need is a browser, that's literally what I mean. All you need is a browser. If I have a browser, it can be IE, which is what most people use, but you can be running a Safari, you can be running Chrome, you can run running Opera. Whatever browser you want, it becomes browser agnostic. So I can sit at home and work on my MacBook and access Costpoint 7. I can sit on my iPad on a train going to the office. Obviously, I don't want to do data entry on iPad, but if I want to look up information real quick or just do a quick query or do find out some information, the ability to do that on my iPad or my iPhone for that matter, or a BlackBerry or anything else that has a browser, that gives you a great great deal of flexibility and power. The last thing I want to kind of highlight real quick for you is the ability for extensibility, which is kind of their way of doing customization within Costpoint. In Costpoint 6 and prior, if you need a customization done to Costpoint, you would have to go through, write up specs, give it to Deltek. They would go through, create this customization, deliver it to you, and you loaded it in. But then every time you did an upgrade, you had to wait for them to update your customization. With Costpoint 7, because they're using Java and web technology, they have built-in web services. With the capabilities around those web services allows you to go through and extend the system itself. I can't make changes to core functionality within Costpoint, but I can add additional things to it. For instance, if there's a required field in Costpoint, I can't make it no longer required. However, if there's a field that I want to capture information in that's not required by Costpoint itself, I can, through extensibility, create a trigger that forces it to be required. Some other areas we've seen extensibility done. When you're working on your incurred cost submission, one of the requirements as part of the incurred cost submission is to do contract briefs. There's a great deal of contract information captured in the project system within Costpoint, but not everything you need to do a contract brief. So we have a client who's actually gone out, they've customized Costpoint through extensibility, added those additional fields into Costpoint. So now when they go through They can run the reports. They can capture all the information directly in Costpoint. They don't have to keep two different systems and try to combine it. They keep all the information right there in Costpoint in one place. They can run a report and get all the information right out of Costpoint. It makes their incurred cost submissions much more efficient, much easier to maintain.
Another example for web services, Randy, we've done one here at NeoSystems, GovCard Connect, that leverages web services to create a credit card payment processing module. It's a SaaS offering, and it allows you to leverage all that data you already have in Costpoint and then to accept a credit card payment from the government or any of your customers. So you can accept a credit card or a purchase card, and it will pull the invoice data, send that off to get processed. And then one of the great things about it is then when that deposit falls into your bank, it remembers which invoices you have against that deposit and makes the reconciliation so much easier. Leveraging web services to make your job more efficient.
And that is a great example, Brian. We have a lot of clients who they're a smaller part of a larger corporation. And as part of that, they have to report information up to their parent. Well, in the past, they generally had to run some type of report out of Cognos and either dump it into a flat file and upload it, or possibly do data entry. Through extensibility, they can actually build interfaces between those two systems. So they're able to capture that information in Costpoint. When they're ready, run the process of the procedure, they'll output that file and load it directly into their parents' books for them. So there's a great deal of functionality there, a great deal of flexibility, and a great deal of power that is really limited only by your requirements. Just to highlight a few of the improved usability features, in Costpoint 6 and prior, pretty much everything that was available in a form view. And by form view, I'm talking about there's generally, it's looks like a paper form. There's a title, and beside it there's a field for data entry. Sometimes that's good. It's clean. It's a nice, clean interface. But there are times that we're all accountants. We're used to working in Excel, and Excel sometimes is a much more flexible media to work through. So what they've done at Costpoint 7 has given you the ability to flip between a table view and a form view. So when I go into a screen, I can look at it like I normally would on a table view, but I can hit a button at the top of the screen itself, and it'll flip it up to a table view. Excuse us, we're in a form view, flip it up to a table view, and it basically gives me rows and columns just like an Excel spreadsheet. There's an example there on the screen. The nice thing about that is, if you think back to Costpoint 6, when I query information, it comes up there and it gives it to me in a table view, but all I can really do is scroll through it and look at it. I can't interact with it. In Costpoint 7, in the table view, that's a live table. I'm able to go in and interact with the system. I can go through, I can create new rows, so I can actually do my data entry in a table view, if that makes sense. Or I can go through, I can change information. I can, just like before with tables, I can move columns around, resize columns and things like that. I can also right-click at the top of a column and resort that column, either ascending or descending, or I can do searches and replaces. So if I'm looking into projects and Mary Sue has left our company and I've got a new project manager coming in, Jane Smith, I'm able to go through, do a search and replace and change project managers without having to go through and touch every single record. So that's another way that saves information or saves you time and flexibility. Another example is when you typically look at an accounts payable voucher screen, everybody is used to the top being in a form view and the bottom part being in a table view. So you can look at the form because there's just one bit of information. But in the table view, you see all the various rows of your AP voucher or a purchase order, same thing. Well, that's great, but there's a lot of columns out there. So if you're trying to look at that, make sure you've got everything entered and everything's accurate, you're constantly scrolling back and forth between, some of these tables have 70, 80 columns in them. So it can get really inefficient and frustrating trying to look at all of that, especially if you're starting to look at multiple records. Well, since this capability exists in Costpoint 7, I can actually go into that child table and take that table rows and flip it into a form, And now for that particular line item on my AP voucher or a purchase order, I can actually see everything in one screen or maybe a couple tabs, but it makes it much more user-friendly and easier to view the entire record at once versus having to scroll back and forth. Another nice feature that's in Costpoint 7 is full screen capabilities. Going back to when Costpoint was first developed in the early to mid-90s, the standard screen size back then was 800 by 600. Well, that was nice, but you know, we've come a long way, baby, if you remember that commercial. You know, actually a few years ago when Deltek first started developing Costpoint 7, the standard screen was 1024 by 768. You know, now we've got 24-inch monitors. These things are, you know, 19,000 by 26,000, and just, you know, incredible resolution. Well, who wants to work on this 24-inch monitor with this little tiny screen in the top left-hand corner? With Costpoint 7, you're actually able to take advantage of those full screen capabilities, particularly in the table view. There's a button in the top right-hand corner of the table where you can click on it and it'll expand all the way out. If you've got a 24-inch monitor, it'll use the entire 24 inches. If you're not as lucky and you have a 17-inch monitor, it'll still take advantage of that full 17 inches. And then you can click the button and it'll go right back to its native size. The other nice thing about that is once I rearrange my columns and I've set the table to the size I want to work with, I can go through and save that. In Costpoint 6, you could save that, but that layout was applicable to everybody. You couldn't customize it for each individual person. In Costpoint 7, every single person can have their own customization. Doesn't mean you have to. If you want to control your environment and the way your users use the system, you can go and set up a standard that everyone uses. But if you want to give them the flexibility to customize their own screens, you can do that. Now, a while ago when I was talking about the reports, I alluded to the ability to output reports to an Excel format, but it's all there and it's formatted so you really can't work with it very well. Since I'm working in a table view, I'm actually able to go through, select the rows that I'm interested in, and I can copy those rows out and then just simply copy and paste into Excel. So if I want to do some GL analysis, I can go to my GL inquiry screen, you know, pull it down to the counts I'm interested in, the periods, the transactions, pull all these transactions up on the screen, highlight those rows, copy them back out into Excel, and now I can do that analysis I needed to do. I no longer have to go into Cognos, or if I don't know Cognos, have somebody else to go into Cognos for me, have to run a report, send a file to me. So it saves time and it saves some frustration from having to use a different package just to get some basic information. Along the same lines is the ability to what they call quick reports in Costpoint. Traditionally, Costpoint gave you reports and just report applications. Costpoint now gives you quick reports, or the ability to report on nearly every screen within Costpoint. So I'm going through and I'm setting up some projects, and I just want to do a quick report of what's the project structure around this particular project. I want to see all the legs of it. I want to see some information about it. Rather than have to go out of my projects table, go over to my project setup table, print it out, or go into Cognos and print out a report, I can right there in my project setup screen go through there, go to the top, and print out a report. I can select just the single project that I'm working on at the time, or I can select all the reports that have been queried, called up as part of my query. So again, you're just trying to make information available to you in an easier method. The last thing I want to point out is the multiple record save. In Costpoint 6, whenever I enter or edit records, I have to make my changes, save it, go to the next record. Make my changes, save it, then go to the next record, so on and so forth. It becomes really tedious and slow and frustrating having to go through all those steps, laboriously. In Costpoint 7, you're able to go through, do all of your edits, do all your data entry, and then when you're finished, you can hit save once at the end. So it's just another way to save time. That was one of the big savers I talked about earlier with my example of setting up the employee leave records. Because I didn't have to save 240 times, I only had to save 3 times. It just tremendous amount of time saved. Now we've talked about some of the features and the functionality and advantages we're going to Costpoint 7. Let's look at some of the implications of what that means. with everything there's always good and there's bad. The good thing about Costpoint 7 is you don't have to pay for the new software. If you're currently active on your Costpoint maintenance and you're all current, then Costpoint 7 is just an upgrade just like you would get anything else. There's no additional cost for that. The bad part, however, is because Costpoint 7 is a whole new architecture, it requires a different server infrastructure. So if you have a great extra server sitting around, that's great. You can repurpose those. But if not, you're going to have to go through and somehow acquire that new infrastructure. There are ways that things you can do. For instance, here at NeoSystems, we do hosting. So if you're looking for somebody to host your Costpoint system while you're testing it, we can do that for you. We can bring your Costpoint system in from 6, upgrade it to 7, give you access. You go through, you can do all your testing. And then at that point, if you want to bring it back into your live environment when you're ready to go live, you can, by that time, have a chance to obtain your new infrastructure and acquire it. You can bring everything back, run it, or if you're happy, you can leave it with us and we'll continue to host it for you. One of the critical things, and we'll talk about this a little bit later as we go through the steps, is it's very important that you thoroughly test Costpoint 7. As I said, when we moved Costpoint 7 from Costpoint 6 to the web, it was an entire total rewrite. The only thing that really stayed the same is the stored procedures in the database itself. But since every screen and every single application had to be touched, all the logic that formerly was enabled or performed on your local machine, now being performed on the web server, had to be rewritten. Well, obviously, they changed languages as well. So what this means is you literally need to go through and test every single screen. Typically, if you upgraded from 5 to 6 or 6 to 6.1, generally you might go through and just test your main processes and procedures you do, or test the new functionality, things like that, but you wouldn't necessarily do an end-to-end testing. In Costpoint 7, it's critical that you do an end-to-end testing. Test every single screen, even setting screens. Go in there and look at that setting screens, make sure that things came over right, things are being saved. There are a few new setting screens that you've got to at least go through and establish, because they come over blank, and if you don't establish that, you're going to get errors. There's also occasionally, because of some minor functionality changes, there's some new checkboxes and validation fields you need to take a look at in your setting screens. So it's important that you go through all of those. Another important thing is to make sure that you're maintaining the current version via hotfixes. Hotfixes are the web's version of what we used to refer to as patches in Costpoint 6. Deltek's constantly updating the system, getting new fixes out there. It's been live for going on 2 years now. So there's been a lot of fixes out there, but they're continually fix things every day. As was mentioned earlier, I ran QC for a while at Deltek, and while Deltek does everything they can to test as many scenarios as they can, with 1,000 clients on Costpoint, there's capability of 1,000 different implementations and 1,000 different ways Costpoint was implemented. So it's impossible for them to virtually test every single possible scenario. So you want to make sure that you're current, they fixed everything, and you're got everything there. Because I can promise you, you find an issue, you call up Deltek, the first thing they're going to look at it and go, well, what version are you on? You say, well, I'm on version 16. So, well, the current version is 19. Upgrade, then call me back. So they're not trying to be nasty, but they've already fixed a lot of issues. They want to make sure you're current and they're working efficiently for you. The last part is the training. Costpoint's Costpoint. As you're moving from 6 to 7, the functionality is largely the same. How the user interacts with the system is going to be totally different. So it's very critical that you get your employees trained on the new functionality, the new user interaction. We'll talk about some ways to do that a little bit later. But largely, the paradigm we tend to think of when we talk about the training and the user interaction. A few years ago, whenever I went from Microsoft Office 2003 to 2007, the functionality is still there. You can still write documents. You can still create PowerPoint slides. You can still do your calculations all within Excel. But where you went to look for functionality in the menus were different. And that's the same type thing with Costpoint. What we have found is people who are ingrained in Costpoint 6 They know Costpoint 6, they work great, but they go to Costpoint 7, and it's a struggle for them because things aren't where they expected them to be. Sometimes, you know, it's been laid out logically, but that's not the way their logic works. They've been trained a certain way. What we have found here at NeoSystems through our implementations and working both with clients upgrading from Costpoint 6 to 7, as well as new implementations of Costpoint 7 where people are starting from scratch, is new employees or new people to Costpoint learn Costpoint 7 faster than people learned Costpoint 6. It's much more intuitive, it's easy to learn, and makes sense to people. But again, people moving from 6 to 7 have that learning curve that they need to go through. So it does trip them up a little bit.
And in a couple of slides, Randy's going to start talking about the best practices for your planning and scheduling your upgrade. But I wanted to take a moment to share some information that Deltek had provided to customers at Insight. Although the technical upgrade might just take you a few weeks and can be done very quickly, it's the planning, the testing, and the training that's going to take you longer. And those are things that you need to schedule for. And a couple of things I also want to highlight is that with the changes, the troubleshooting can become a little challenging. If I may, an analogy to, especially with all the weather we've been having around the D.C. area, there's a lot of potholes out there on the road these days. And the first time you drive a road and that pothole pops up and it hits you, it'll take you by surprise. But I drive the same route every day, if I'm like many of you who commute, and I kind of know where the potholes are. So I change lanes, I get ahead of it, and I know, and I can avoid them. And that's one of the advantages, and that's why Deltek recommends hiring some help with it. It can save you so much time. It really can save you time. If you know where the potholes are, or at least if you hit one, you recognize it for what it is. It's like, oh, that's different in Costpoint 7. You just need to configure it this way. Bang, bang, we're done. So that's some of the things where consultants like NeoSystems, sorry for the plug, you know, we can really help you out there, help you avoid the potholes during the upgrade, and make it a smooth ride for you. So I want to turn it back to Randy now so he can talk to you about the best practices as you schedule your upgrade.
Thank you, Brian. So as we look at this, the dark timeline across the top is really more of the function, or excuse me, the technical path you follow through the upgrade. I'm not going to really talk about that today. If you're interested, we do have the CIO's Guide webinar that was done a few weeks ago that is available on the NeoSystems website. I would encourage you to go out and take a look at that. What I really want to focus on today is the light blue timeline. That's really more of the functional steps you're going to go through leading up to your cutover. So the first thing we want to do is start looking at our security and just kind of doing a functional review of the system itself. When you upgrade from Costpoint 6 to Costpoint 7, all the data comes over largely, you know, as you expect it to. There's a couple areas that do not come over from Costpoint 7, either not at all or not very cleanly. The first area we want to talk about is security. The way Costpoint does security in 6 versus the way it's implemented in Costpoint 7 is extremely different. Part of that is because there's new navigation and new functionality within the modules themselves. So that's going to lend itself to a poor mapping from the way 6 was set up to the way Costpoint 7 was set up. But in addition to that is just the functionality itself of the way security is done. In Costpoint 6, when you set up your security, an employee can only belong to one user group. So you wind up with these kind of a hodgepodge where you're trying to cram a lot into a user group, or you wind up with this really nasty maintenance thing where every single employee is their own user group. So what you wind up doing is when you're putting either a person into multiple people into a single user group and then doing all sorts of one-offs to give them the rights or take away rights on specific modules that they need. Or, like I said before, you create a one-for-one between the user groups and the employees themselves. In Costpoint 7, you can actually belong to multiple user groups. So you can really go through and figure out from a functional standpoint, what does that user group need to look like? So I can set up a user group for my AP data entry people. I can set up a user group for my AP supervisors or approvers. Then I can set up a third group for AP reporting. So I can have my clerks in the AP data entry and my AP reporting groups, and I can have my supervisor and the AP supervisor in the reporting groups. And because I can have them in multiple groups, it makes it a lot easier to manage now. I can still go through, and if I have to do a one-off, I can do that, but it eliminates the need for doing those types of things. The other nice thing about another thing that's not really mentioned here is when I set up security in Costpoint 7, if you think back to Costpoint 6, when you go into Costpoint 6, everything is there. Every single module is in Costpoint, whether you're licensed for it or not, whether you have rights to it or not. So what happens is people get a little bored and they start kind of meandering through the system going, oh, I wonder what this is, and clicking on it to find out do they have access or not. And occasionally you've messed up in security and given somebody rights to something they shouldn't necessarily have, especially because you've got to do this really hodgepodge of trying to set up security for people. One of the really cool things in Costpoint 7 is what you have rights to is what you see on the menu. So if I'm an AP clerk and I don't have rights to timesheets, guess what? I don't see timesheets. Actually, I don't even see the people module or domain in there. So it really limits you to what you can see to actually what you have access to. It helps keep people from wasting time just meandering around, but also just makes it a lot easier for them to navigate and understand the system. They're not strung out with, where are all these things? It's very clear where they are. If you have somebody who pops in, just occasionally, perhaps you're using, in your purchasing, you're doing requisitions, and you have a project manager, and all they really do is go in and approve purchase requisitions. Well, you set them up with rights to just do that, their menu is going to be really simple. They're going to see materials, receiving, approve purchase requisitions, and that's it. So it makes it really easy for them to get in, do their thing, and get back out, and not have to spend time going through the menus, especially if it's something you don't do it on a regular basis. Yeah, as much as I work in Costpoint 7, I still don't have everything memorized exactly where it is, and sometimes I'll have to go searching for it. Simplify things, makes it easier for your users. The last thing is more granular control within the applications themselves. A really good example for that is there's an application compute and print commitments. Well, there's a lot of people that may have a need to go in and see, well, what are the commitments that are on my project as opposed to the actual charges that have hit. Well, the way that application is set up, it's like titled, it's compute and print commitments, which means not only can I print the commitments, I can also compute them. Well, if I've gone through as part of my monthly closing and I've already computed my commitments and I've got them posted and ready to go and do my financial reporting, the last thing I want is somebody else going back in there and recomputing them and changing something. So what you're able to do is go through there and within that application turn off one of those functionalities. So I can give somebody access to go through to the application itself and they're able to print the report, but they don't have rights to compute it. So it gives you a great deal of functionality and control within the security itself. One other quick thing they added in Costpoint 7 that if you're in a large organization is they added segregation of duties. What that does is it goes through and you can set up things so that, for instance, the person who does the billing can also be the person that sets up customers. So the person that does AP checks can also be the person that sets up vendors. And you go through and you set up where those conflicts exist within your infrastructure or within your company policies. And once you set up those conflicts, you can then have Costpoint go and run reports for you and tell you, hey, Joe Smith has rights to set up vendors and AP checks. That's a no-no. Or perhaps he's an exception because you're a small organization. While you don't want that to occur, you've got to do that because you don't have enough people to do every single, have one person per job. So you can go through and you can say, well, that's an override. He's an exception, but it'll apply that rule to everybody else. So if you're having to go through, do SOX audits, it really gives you the ability to go through and have much more control and not be surprised by what the auditors may find when they come in. So as part of your functional review, you want to go through, the other thing that doesn't come across is your stored parameters. Like I said, the security can come over, but doesn't come over cleanly. Your stored parameters, however, don't come over at all. And by stored parameters, what I'm talking about is when you go through and you've set up your project status report with all the columns that you want, the criteria, Those are, when you save that, that's called stored parameters. So you want to make sure that you understand that those do not come over. So as you're going through your testing, it's a good chance to go through to an audit of what stored parameters you're using, what are duplicates, narrow that list down, and rebuild those as part of your testing. You also want to take a look at what interfaces, integrations you currently have or need to have, so you can kind of figure those out, get those documented, and plan those as part of your implementations. Also, again, there's not a whole lot of new functionality in Costpoint, but there is some. So take advantage of, look and see what that is, figure out what you can take advantage of, or what's really not applicable to you. And lastly, it gives you the opportunity to do a business process review. Look at how you do things. Are you working efficiently from an overall business process? Are there things you could do to improve that your business flow within the system itself? So as you move into testing, this is where you're going to want to spend a lot of time. As I've preached and spent a lot of time on earlier, you got to make sure the testing is thorough, but it also gives you a chance to go through using your desktop procedures. If you have them, update those desktop procedures with new screenshots, things like that. Or if you don't have desktop procedures, it's an opportunity time to go create those desktop procedures. Because you're having to go through all your processes anyway, you can do your screenshots, save those in a document, and document that process. We recommend a two-phase approach to your testing. The first phase is kind of a processing and reporting phase, and the second one is more transactional based. So from a processing phase, that's really wrapped around the month end and all the processing that's associated with month end. So what you want to do there is begin with a copy of your database right before you close. And the reason you do that is because you've got an entire month's worth of data captured already. So at that point, you grab a copy of it, move it over, upgrade that to Costpoint 7, and then you can go back and finish closing your month out at Costpoint 6. Once you've done that, you can then flip over to Costpoint 7, run those same processes at Costpoint 7, and it makes it very easy to do apples-to-apples comparison because I've got full data in both systems. So once I've done that, I've gone through, I've tested my processes, make sure the process worked, and generally your month end is your critical processes anyway. So you've tested those out, you're comfortable, and you know that everything works, and you have an idea of what your processing times are going to be like in Costpoint 7 as opposed to Costpoint 6. The second phase of your testing is more your transactional testing. Most of us don't have a slack in their schedule or enough staff to go through and do 100% data entry between two systems. So what you want to do is where you can take advantage of 100% data entry, for instance, in timesheets, I've got it there in the batch. They're already there, easy. I can load that in Costpoint 6 and 7. However, things like AP vouchers, journal entries, things like that, I can't do 100% data entry. So what you want to do is capture a sampling of your normal transactions as well as make sure you capture your unique or your one-off transactions. Process those through both systems. Process it through Costpoint 7, start it from your data entry, process it all the way through to an invoice or report or wherever the output is for that. Make sure you're getting output that you're expecting from that and things are processing properly. This is a great opportunity to test your Cognos reports. Again, the database itself is not largely changing, but you don't want to find out after the fact that you're live that, oh, my Cognos report doesn't work because they changed one column. Find that, go through and test that now. Likewise, make sure you test all your interfaces because the way interfaces in Costpoint 7 works is very different from Costpoint 6. I'm not going to go over all these in detail, but these, through our experience working with clients, these are some of the areas that we've found to be higher risk areas. Payroll, kind of the projects, the billings. We've recently ran into an issue in the billings area where some of our supporting schedules are not coming out the way we expect them to, so we're working with Deltek to fix those. Again, the pre-processors are different, things like that. So as you're going through it, again, test everything, but these are some areas we have found some anomalies, we'll say. So I've kind of combined the training and the text execution together because really as you're going through, you go through and you train your employees, but as they're going through testing, that's the opportunity for them to put that learning into practice. So as you want to do your training, and what we found the best way to train that is instead of getting everyone in a room and giving them their overall training, it's still the same training, but you want to break it into modules. So you have all your AP people together, you go through the training, but with them you use AP screens for your examples. Then when you move over, you bring in your billing people and your projects people. Again, it's the exact same training, but now instead of using AP screens, I'm using projects or billing screens. So it's things that they can relate to, and it helps them to enforce their learning. Also, as you're going through your testing, you want to make sure there's somebody there that can work with you, do some coaching, answer questions, which leads us to test-a-thons. A best practice we found is rather than here you 15 people go to your office and test these things, it's better to schedule a time, get everybody in the room, and have them go through 3 or 4 hours doing what we call a test-a-thon. It forces them to get the testing done, which is one nice thing. But the other nice thing is you've got somebody there as a coach that can walk around, that can answer questions as they come up. Chances are if person A has a question, person B is probably going to have a similar question. So as questions comes up, you can answer the question once for everybody. They also tend to learn off of each other because they'll say, well, when I do this, they'll say, oh, I hadn't thought about considering that. And it'll help them be more thorough in their testing. Lastly, plan for post-deployment support. There's something about training and all like that people look at the training, they understand it, great. They walk out the door and there's like a magnet in the doorway that sucks it all out of their brain. So then they come back in and they're live and they're like, how do I do this again? I can't remember. So it pays to have somebody there for the first few days as they're going through the post-live, work with them, be there to answer questions, help them through that anxiety as having something new. With issue resolution, as I mentioned earlier, I'd love to tell you it's 100% perfect, but it's not going to be. You want to make sure you're maintaining a log of issues and you're giving yourself time in your testing to go through, find out those issues, get them corrected, and be able to go back and do some retesting. So keep that log. Don't let things slip through the cracks. People will say, oh, I'll remember that, I'll get back to it later, and then suddenly they're live and they have to do it for real, and that becomes a problem for them. So as you counter issues, keep the log of it, work with Deltec, work through those issues. And this is another way when you've got a coach there working with you, somebody who's been through this, a lot of times they can tell you that's not an issue, that's a different way of doing it, here's how you do it now. It can help you redefine your processes and procedures. So finally, when it comes time to cut over, critical, do your reconciliation.